All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar on ERA's $40 million Food, Farming, and Forestry Challenge. My name is Mark Summers. I'm the Executive Director of Technology and Innovation for Emissions Reduction Alberta, or ERA.
I'm Steve MacDonald, the CEO for ERA. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Steve and I will be passing the microphone back and forth today as we talk about our Food, Farming, and Forestry Challenge. And we'll both be here after the presentation to answer some questions during the Q&A period. Before we get into the agenda, I'd like to start by going through a few housekeeping items just to make sure we get the most out of our time today. First of all, we're expecting as many as 400 participants today. We've got 261 on the line right now. So everyone's microphone is muted to avoid unintentional background noise. If you encounter technical challenges related to the webinar connection, please feel free to email Amanda using info@eralberta.ca, and we'll try to help where we can. However, if you can't resolve your technical issues or if you need to leave early, we will be posting a recording of this webinar on our website on the specific page for the Food, Farming, and Forestry Challenge. The recording will include both the presentation and the live Q&A with audio. All right, in terms of an agenda for today's webinar, we plan to cover a few items that will hopefully be helpful for everyone on the line. First, Steve will talk briefly about ERA and our mandate as an organization. Next, we'll provide an overview of the Food, Farming, and Forestry Challenge that was announced on June 1st by the Minister of Alberta Environment and Parks, Jason Nixon. We'll cover some key points related to the scope and eligibility of the call, the submission process, and the timelines around our funding decision. We'll also provide some advice for anyone on the line that's interested in making a submission. And finally, we'll end off by answering some of your questions in a Q&A period. So if you do have questions that you'd like us to address, we'll get there at the end, but you'll be typing them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have, but if we don't get around to your question, you're welcome to follow up with us afterward. So with that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to our CEO, Steve MacDonald, who will get things started with an overview of ERA.
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to begin by chatting a bit about how ERA fulfills the vision, mandate, and strategic priorities that you see on this slide. Established more than a decade ago, ERA has been the mechanism for investing the carbon price paid by large industrial emitters directly into clean energy solutions that reduce costs and lower emissions. Our work spans all sectors and timescales. Over the years, governments have changed, climate policy and goals have shifted, and regulatory frameworks have been modified. But one of the constants in Alberta has been a commitment to use public dollars to leverage the significant investments required to identify and scale up the innovation that will ensure Alberta succeeds in a lower carbon world. The last point I want to make on this slide is that our vision is anchored in the belief that our success is measured in both economic and environmental terms. We fondly refer to this as the genius of and vision. The two outcomes are not mutually exclusive. While many jurisdictions have a mechanism to invest in technology, ERA's business model is unique. Our structure and model allow us to respond quickly to the needs of Alberta's innovation system and industries, ensure multi-year projects are possible and funded, and reinvest funds when projects do not progress according to the best laid plans. And as we've realized over the last few months, there are things such as global pandemics and oil price collapses that are beyond our control and require us to adapt and pivot. As I previously mentioned, ERA's portfolio includes projects that align both with Alberta's economic and environmental priorities. Our investments are guided by our technology roadmap, which defines technology pathways and areas of focus for ERA's funding portfolio. The roadmap is a living document. We regularly review it to ensure we are being responsive to the changing needs of the province's industries, innovators, and investors. Our four focus areas include cleaner oil and gas, low emitting electricity supply and demand, food, fiber, and bio industries, and finally, low carbon industrial processes and products. You might have heard the government's announcement earlier this month about their plans to wind down Energy Efficiency Alberta at the end of September. The government reinforced in its decision the importance of energy savings and emissions reduction programming targeting industrial and commercial businesses. Our goal is to identify the best way to leverage the capacity of EEA to expand our portfolio to deliver the outcomes the government is seeking. ERA's portfolio represents opportunities across multiple timescales. Some have immediate impacts by attracting investment, creating jobs, and reducing emissions before the project is even finished. These projects are exciting because the results are quantifiable now. They are about doing the same things better. We also are looking at transformative opportunities that can change the face of a current industry in which they're being applied. A third group of these exciting technologies that don't address an immediate industry need, but that rather they create new markets, new economic activity, and new jobs through sustainable technology. They can grow the economy without growing emissions. This is all about doing better things. We have two ways to fund projects: through targeted challenges. You can see on this slide some examples, including our Oil Sands Innovation Challenge, Industrial Efficiency Challenge, and our BEST Challenge that focused on biotechnology, electricity, and sustainable transportation. We also have our Partnership Intake Program, which allows us to work closely with our trusted partners to leverage funds and due diligence, share risk, and reduce the administrative burden for applicants. Trusted partnerships help us deliver a unified approach across the Canadian innovation system. To date, we have committed $534 million to support 161 projects valued at over $4 billion. The large project value is reflective of the fact that ERA tends to focus on later stage technology with higher capital costs. It also reflects our ability to leverage more than 6-to-1 funding from partner projects. And we are on track to deliver cumulative GHG reductions of 33 million tons by 2030. And these investments will also lead to the creation of the equivalent of over 20,000 person-year jobs by 2024 in Alberta and contribute over $3 billion to the province's GDP. Looking nationally, these numbers increase to 30,000 person-year jobs and $4 billion in GDP. Before I pass things back over to Mark, I want to offer a bit of background on our past investments in food, farming, and bioindustries. This slide shows us that this is not a new space for us. We've already invested over $100 million since 2009. The 44 projects cross all stages from research and development to deployment. And they include a broad range of technologies from biorefining to waste management. So after my little chat with you, I hope you have a little better context of who we are, the outcomes we are trying to achieve, and how we work to identify and accelerate technologies that will improve Alberta's competitiveness. With that, I'm going to hand this back over to Mark, who will get into the details of our latest funding challenge.
All right, thank you, Steve. So let me start by saying we designed this challenge with input at various stages from farmers, foresters, the agriculture and forestry industries, our partners in the innovation system, and others, many of whom are listening in today. The final scope reflects the valuable feedback that we heard. Let me also say that agriculture and forestry are critical to the economy and to the history of Alberta. These industries directly employ over 100,000 Albertans and export almost $15 billion worth of primary and secondary products. What we heard from the industry is that there are significant opportunities to enhance our global competitiveness, to retain and create new jobs, and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by harnessing the power of innovation. So in this challenge, we're making $40 million available for projects that advance these innovative opportunities toward commercialization and large-scale implementation. So on this slide, we've listed a handful of examples from what we heard are areas that are ripe with opportunities. But I want to be clear before I get into the list. What's listed here and what's listed in the program guide document are just examples. I have no doubt that there are fantastic and impactful innovations we didn't hear about and we don't yet know about. But some of the examples we did hear about include things like regenerative agriculture, land use changes, and nature-based solutions that enrich the soil and increase soil organic carbon. Things like advanced genomics for improving the resiliency and productivity of our forests, or making use of residues and waste streams from these industries to create valuable products. Things like nutrient management, novel fertilizers, advanced cultivation techniques, addressing biological methane emissions, new frontiers in precision agriculture, improved forest management and silviculture, and some critical enablers for greenhouse gas benefits like novel measurement techniques to quantify and validate the reductions from some of these practices. And many others. As I said, these are just a few examples. So with that introduction to the Food, Farming, and Forestry Challenge, I'd like to get into some of the details around the eligibility, the fund matching rules, and the process. I'll start by taking a moment to emphasize that we fund capital P projects. And what I mean by this is that our funding goes toward projects with clear objectives, well-defined milestones, timelines, and deliverables. The goal of our funding is to take technology or innovation from point A to point B in terms of accelerating it toward commercialization. So what this means is we don't fund things like ongoing operations or open-ended programs. In this challenge, we're open to projects that involve field testing, pilots, commercial demonstrations, or first-of-kind commercial implementation of new innovation. Applicants and technology providers can be local Albertans, of course, can be Canadians, or even internationally based. We know and we've seen over our history that good ideas and good technology can come from anywhere. However, the catch is, while technology can come from anywhere in the world, those innovations must be put into the field or into the facilities here in Alberta. We'll accept proposals from pretty much any type of entity: farmers, ranchers, foresters, forest product manufacturers, innovators, technology developers, Indigenous communities, small and medium enterprises, large corporations, industrial associations, R&D organizations, post-secondary institutions, municipalities, and potentially even some others. As always, partnerships are both eligible and encouraged to submit applications. Partnerships, in many cases, can often strengthen an opportunity by bringing together different skill sets and assets to make a project happen. So as I mentioned, we have a maximum of $40 million available for this challenge, with up to $5 million per project. We match eligible expenses on up to a one-to-one basis. However, I should note that in some cases here with this challenge, we may be willing to go a little beyond one-to-one matching if a compelling justification is provided, particularly for some of the smaller projects. We have a fairly detailed eligible expenses document on our website already that you can look up if you'd like to read more about what is considered eligible and what is not. In broad strokes, I will say that incremental project costs related to capital, labor, equipment, materials, and subcontractors are all eligible. But please take a look at the document because, as always, there are details and nuances that we can't capture in a short webinar. We only match costs incurred on a go-forward basis. Now, it's fine if there are activities that precede ERA's involvement, like feasibility studies or project development activities, but strictly speaking, our dollars can only match those that are spent after our board's funding approval. The maximum length for projects is 3 years in this challenge from commencement of the project. And finally, on this slide, I want to emphasize that this is a highly competitive process and not all projects will be approved for funding. We have a rigorous selection process simply because the demand for our dollars far exceeds the amount of money we have available. In fact, we often receive 10 or more times the amount we have available in funding requests. So it's important that your proposal makes a strong case for why your project should be funded. So I'll run through our submission and evaluation process here. And on the next slide, I'll talk about the timelines for this process. As you can see in the diagram here, we have a two-stage evaluation process followed by execution of the project. In the expression of interest or EOI stage, applicants are invited to provide basically an overview of their proposed project. This is a relatively short document, 8 pages maximum, and must be submitted using our online system, of course, by the August 27th deadline. I'll say this again, but we will not extend the deadline and we will not accept late submissions. After the EOIs have been submitted, they are then evaluated by a team of independent experts. We bring together a team of evaluators with subject matter expertise in business, in finance, in agrology, silviculture, engineering, and of course, greenhouse gas quantification. After the EOI process, a short list of projects will be invited to submit a full project proposal, or what we call an FPP, which includes much more detail about the proposed project itself and the expected outcomes of the project and the plan for implementing the project. At the full proposal stage, an advisor is assigned to each of the applicants, I should say, to help guide you through the process and provide feedback for the FPP document, as well as the oral presentation while you're developing both of these. After the FPPs are submitted, they are again evaluated by an independent team of experts, and all full proposal applicants will be invited to offer a presentation to the evaluation team. This process then culminates with an in-depth review meeting where all of the remaining projects are discussed in detail and a recommendation is ultimately brought forward to our board for consideration. I should note that all the funding decisions for this challenge will be made by ERA's board of directors. After the funding decisions are made, we then enter into legal agreements with each of the successful applicants. And this legal agreement details the terms and obligations of each party, us and the recipient, as it relates to our contribution and to completion of the project. Our funding is then distributed on a milestone by milestone basis, and the progress of each project is monitored and reported on throughout the course of the project. At the end of the project, all recipients are required to produce a final outcomes report, which is ultimately shared publicly for the broader benefit of Alberta. And the final thing to note here is that this entire process is overseen by an independent fairness monitor that reports directly to ERA's board of directors. In fact, I'm skimming through the list. I believe our fairness monitor is in the audience today on the webinar. So this evaluation process happens between now and February 2021. The deadline for submission is August 27th at 5 p.m. Mountain Time, and that's 5 p.m. sharp. The online system automatically closes submission functionality right as our system's clock flips over from 4:59 to 5 p.m. That's 5 p.m. with 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and 0 fractions of a second. I apologize for being over scrupulous, but this is an important detail. Again, please note that we will not be extending the deadline and we will not accept late submissions. Once you've submitted your application, you'll receive an automatically generated email from the system to confirm your submission has indeed been received. If for whatever reason you don't get that email, there's a couple things you can do. So please first go back into the system and double check that everything was properly completed. If there are some parts that are missing, it won't let you finish your submission. You need to complete all the requirements before you can have a complete submission. And if you've done that and everything has been submitted, but you still don't have the email, maybe the next thing you can do is to check your junk mail folder. We've seen some of these emails wind up in the junk mail folder in the past. And if all else fails, you're welcome to email us and say, hey, what gives? And we'll try to get back to you as promptly as possible. Projects that are shortlisted in the EOI phase will be notified in October of this year, or by October of this year, and will have until early December to provide their full proposals. And then the oral presentations will be scheduled in the new year, likely at the end of January or the start of February, coming up to our February board meeting decision. Applicants, all full proposal applicants will be notified of ERA's final funding decision shortly after our February board meeting, probably in the first or perhaps the second week of March 2021. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about before we open the floor for your questions, I see that some questions are coming in already, is some, I would say, advice on how to prepare a successful submission. First, and this is very simple, I would recommend that you start the process now. From today until the submission deadline, there are more than 8 weeks. And I know that it doesn't take 8 weeks to put together an 8-page document. That's true. However, it does take time to forge partnerships, to get internal approvals, to allocate organizational resources, and to start lining up financing options and get further down that, as far down that process as you can. And certainly you don't need to have every single internal approval and every partnership finalized by the EOI submission deadline. However, this is a highly competitive process, and the further you are along in these processes, the better off you'll be in terms of demonstrating that your project is real and is ready to advance. Secondly, I'll mention that since all submissions need to be completed through our online portal, the ERIMS, please go there today and register an account if you don't have one already. The link is on the slide right about there. Once you get into the system, download all the documents and templates that are available. This will help gauge what you need in order to put together the 8-page document. If you have an account already and if you've submitted an application in the past and you already have an account, I'd recommend that you go back and make sure you can still log into the system and again, download all the relevant documents. Okay, next, and I really can't emphasize this one enough, is please read the call for expressions of interest document. It's really not a long document. It's only 12 pages after the title page and the table of contents. And honestly, it answers most of the questions that we get on a regular basis. If you're working on a project that's not eligible for funding or just simply doesn't fit this call for proposals, you can save yourself a lot of time by reading the guidelines document and figuring that out sooner rather than later. So this next point is really an extension of the last one, and that is to review the evaluation criteria, which are provided in the call for expressions of interest document. These are the criteria upon which each proposal is evaluated and shortlisted, and will help you understand the lens through which we look at your proposals. And as a bit of a side note, I should also mention that each of these criteria have different weightings. While they are all important and all need to be addressed, I would encourage you to consider these weightings as an indication of what's most important to ERA in this challenge. Okay, well, building on that last point once again, when you're completing the expression of interest document, there's a few things to mention. One is it's important to use clear language. Our evaluation team consists of subject matter experts from different fields and with different backgrounds, but if ultimately they can't decipher the information that's necessary to make a qualified assessment, or if the 8-page document is filled with extraneous information, they won't have the confidence to move the application forward in the process. It's equally important to address all the points that are laid out in the template. We put together a template that allows for you to tell the story of your proposal in a way that makes sense to you. However, we've included all of those bullet points in the template. If you haven't seen it, go take a look at it, because those are really the most important pieces of information that you can provide in your submission. Those are the questions that will come up amongst our reviewers during their discussion. So however you want to craft your proposal, please ensure that all of those points are addressed. If you want to complete your proposal simply by going through point by point and answering each of those bullets one by one, that can be an effective approach. And speaking of the 8-page limit, I think it's worth noting that you are welcome, and I would say encouraged, to include optional letters of support. These letters of support do not count as part of the 8-page limit and can be very beneficial to your submission. And last, but certainly not least, please do not wait until the last day to submit your application. I know I've harped on the deadline already a couple times over and over again, but I can tell you that we have lost good opportunities in the past because of deadlines that were missed, in some cases by a matter of seconds and minutes. This is a matter of fairness to all applicants and something that we are firm on. Now, if you have technical issues during the submission process, our IMS team is happy to help resolve technical issues and is, I would say, very responsive to the requests that come in. However, I can assure you that if you wait until the last day, it's entirely possible that we can't address all of the last-minute issues that arise. Between spontaneous Windows updates or network outages and other random computer issues, it's just really not worth waiting until the last minute, or I would say even the last day to submit your application. Okay, so before I move on to address your questions, I want to take a minute to talk about leveraging funding from our trusted partners. As Steve mentioned, we work in close partnership with other funding organizations like Alberta Innovates, SDTC, Natural Resources Canada, the Business Development Bank of Canada, and a handful of others. In some cases, there may be an opportunity for ERA to share your proposal with our trusted partners and explore the possibility to leverage further funding from these organizations. During the submission process, you'll have the opportunity to allow us to share your submissions with our trusted partners, and I very much encourage you to do so. If you agree to this in the system, there's a sort of a checkbox that gives us permission to do that. ERA will only share your application with partners where we have a non-disclosure agreement in place and for the sole purpose of exploring further funding leverage. And I'm very pleased to announce today that Sustainable Development Technology Canada, or SDTC, is partnering with ERA on the Food, Farming and Forestry Challenge. On behalf of our friends at SDTC, I can say that they are excited to participate in this call with ERA with the intent of supporting a new generation of entrepreneurs in the agriculture space. So what this means is that all proposals at the EOI submission stage that fit the criteria of the Food, Farming and Forestry Challenge and who express interest in having their submissions shared will also be evaluated by SDTC. ERA and SDTC will evaluate the proposals cooperatively and may choose to fund projects jointly or even separately in some cases. Applicants will be informed of any additional information required by SDTC. This will happen after the full proposal invitations have been made. ERA will work with SDTC and other related programs to explore co-funding opportunities and reduce the administrative burden for applicants. The last thing I'll mention on this is that the challenge is also well aligned with current and future funding programs through, for example, the Agriculture Funding Consortium, the Canadian Agri-Food Automation and Intelligence Network, or CAIN, potentially the recently announced Canadian Wood Fibre Centre's Forest Innovation Program, and also the new results-driven agricultural research initiative in Alberta. All right, so that puts us at about halfway through our 1-hour webinar. And if you've made it this far and if you're still awake, this is your opportunity to ask questions for Steve and for me. So what I encourage you to do now is to type your questions into the questions pane of the GoToWebinar, or of the control panel, the GoToWebinar control panel, which is typically on the right-hand side of your screen, somewhere over there. And while you do that, I'm going to do that I'm going to bring up the questions panel on my end, and I'll start scrolling through the questions that we have received. So bear with me a moment. We'll get to a couple questions, and we will start to address those. Okay. All right. We have a question here from Jason Bradley around in-kind contributions. Maybe I'll start by taking that one myself, and Steve's welcome to jump in if he has any additional thoughts. But you'll notice if you go to our eligible expense guidelines document that we don't make too much fuss about what we consider cash versus in-kind contributions. It's more of an issue around eligible versus ineligible contributions. And I say that largely because I've found that many people's definitions of in-kind contributions are different between different funding organizations and whatnot. So there are some what are typically considered in-kind contributions that we consider eligible expenses. So for example, if you've got a partnership that's working on a project, and ABC Incorporated is the recipient of the funds, but DEF Incorporated is a partner, and DEF is providing some of their staff or their labor to participate in the project, and there is effectively a cash outlay or a salary associated with paying for that labor that can be quantified and can be accounted for. That's an example of what would be typically an in-kind contribution that we consider eligible. At the highest level, we want incremental go forward costs, but I would refer you to the eligible expenses guidelines document, which has much more information. Okay, so I will move on to thank you, by the way, that was a good question. The next one here is around project location. So I touched on this a little bit, but I think it's a great question that I'll raise again. And the question is that should the projects be performed in Alberta only? I guess I'll start again on that one. I'll try to be brief, and Steve can add his thoughts around this as well. The quick answer is that by the end of the project, we want to see whatever's happening in the field or at the facilities in Alberta. So we want to see steel in the ground, so to speak, in the province of Alberta. The demonstrations, the testing, the pilots, and all that needs to happen in Alberta. But there can be some work that leads up to that, whether it's manufacturing or engineering work or whatever the case that happens outside of Alberta. So it's not exclusively only work happening in Alberta, but ultimately we want to see those things in the province. I don't know if you want to add to that, Steve.
No, I think you nailed it there, Mark.
All right, perfect. Okay, the next one, and maybe I won't jump in on this one, and I apologize for hogging the microphone. Next question is, would this program fund a project that entails substituting a petroleum-based product by a bio-sourced one? Steve, did you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, we've played with projects like that in the past. We're really looking for those innovative technologies that drive both economic and environmental outcomes. So there's not a bias against something that's going to displace one industry over the other. We're looking for, again, those solutions that'll allow Alberta, Canada and the world to be more successful in a low carbon future.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. All right, you're on a roll. I'll give you the next one as well. Is this program stackable with other funding grants?
Yes, it's a simple answer. We still look for that matching component. And with our partnership with SDTC, there will obviously be another opportunity to stack. So it will be important for us to see that industry is at least matching our funding, but it's quite possible that other funding partners are stepping in and also providing funding to make up the total project cost.
Yeah, perfect. That's helpful. All right, the next one is a fairly simple question, and maybe I'll jump in with this. The answer, or the question is, what is the definition? This isn't Jeopardy. What is the definition of a medium-sized enterprise and large corporation? I would say the definitions we follow traditionally are from StatsCan. So, for example, for a small and medium-sized enterprise, I think it's up to and including 499 employees, or so fewer than 500 employees and less than $50 million in annual gross revenue. But I will add that for this competition, the distinction isn't super relevant because SMEs, large corporations, multinationals, even individuals working out of their garage, or individual farmers, for example, are eligible to apply for the funding. Okay, I'm gonna skip down here. Apologize for the delay. I think we touched on this a little bit in the presentation, but it's a great question, and I'll ask Steve to address this one. Where should the company be incorporated or registered?
Yeah, that's not an issue so much in terms of the eligibility. As Mark mentioned, is we're looking for the ideas to be applied here in Alberta. What we often find is good ideas can come from anywhere, and companies that begin in another jurisdiction apply and are successful, but we often see them opening a branch office in Alberta to manage the on-ground activities here. So where you're incorporated isn't the issue. It's the application of the technology and the investment of the resources in Alberta and solutions that drive emission reductions in Alberta and create jobs in Alberta.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Steve. So I know, Steve, you talked about the stacking and the fund matching already, but we had another question that just came in, and I think for just additional clarity, let's address that. The question is, can we use federal or provincial funding toward the matching funds, or does the matching fund only come from industry or private partners?
Do you want me to answer that, Mark?
Sure, you started it, might as well carry on.
Yeah. So the matching is from the private partners. That's the skin in the game from industry that we use as evidence that there's a market need for this, and that the proponent is able to demonstrate to the private sector there's value proposition. So if it's a $10 million project, $3 million could come from us, $3 million from the private sector, and then another $4 million from other levels of government or other funding agencies.
Yeah, a good example. Great. Another question here, and I purposely avoided using the TRL jargon in the presentation. Even though I often throw that acronym around, but we have a question related to what is the TRL of the technology that can be supported by this program. And so, I'm trying to train myself out of speaking in TRL language, because I know it's not language that resonates with everyone, and in particular with some biological processes and biological industries like the agriculture industry. Folks don't often think about things in terms of TRL. However, what I'll say is that our funding is typically geared toward bringing technology into the field up to the levels of TRL 6 at the very low end, but most commonly 7, 8, and right up to the start of what you call TRL 9 or commercial implementation. Maybe just to add a little bit of language around that, it's important to clarify that our funding is not intended for early stage R&D activities. And so typically we'll get involved in innovations that have been proven out at a lab scale in a laboratory environment, where maybe, if a prototype is applicable, a prototype has already been built, a bench scale unit has been built, and now things need to be scaled up and put into the field in a real operational setting. So that's sort of the quick answer to the TRL question. Okay, I'm going to scroll down the list a bit. There's some real fantastic questions. We won't get to them all. Maybe I'll ask Steve this one, although we won't be able to list them all. But who are ERA's trusted partners?
And rather than go through the list, typically they're organizations that are also funding technology in relatively the same space we play in. So think of post-secondary institutions, other levels of government, some limited other investment funds. So that's the type of organizations we look for. And what creates the partnership is we sign a memorandum of understanding with each other so we're clear on what the expectations of each of us as partners is. And we also sign non-disclosure agreements to ensure that we can exchange confidential information and protect the proponents. So SDTC has been mentioned, Alberta Innovates, some of Alberta's post-secondary institutions, some federal government agencies, and of course our funder and partner in the Alberta government.
Thanks, Steve. So this should be a quick one. The question is, what do you mean by letters of support? I'll jump in. I'll start and say that we see letters of support come in a number of forms, but ultimately the common theme is it's a letter demonstrating support from a variety of partners on the project. And so some of the most powerful letters of support can come from partners like financing organizations or other funding organizations, or even industry partners that are providing funds toward the project. So I think that's probably the most common letters of support we see is around shoring up financial support for the project. But it's not the only type of letter of support that can make an impact on an application. There are others. You know, for example, if you're developing a new product and you have a letter of support from a customer, particularly a large customer, whether it's in a commercial entity or an industrial entity, that says that they want to use your product, they're very interested in the product, and if they can go as far as to make a commitment to purchasing your product, those types of letters of support can be really powerful. As well as even on the other side, you know, if you require purchasing or bringing in feedstock for your process, you know, for example, if you're processing agricultural residues or forestry residues, we want to see, ultimately, by the time we fund the project or put money into it, we want to see that that you've got secured agreements for all of the feedstock that's necessary. And so if you have a support letter from someone talking about the amount of feedstock that's available, and that they're interested in entering into some sort of arrangement to provide the feedstock for the project, those can be helpful as well. And you know, I'm just scrolling down the list here. I'll answer this one quickly because there's another one around letters of support, and the question is there a template to use or criteria that the letters need to cover? There's neither a template nor are there specific criteria. In fact, I think I mentioned previously the letters of support are optional. Those can come in whatever form is acceptable to you as well as to the partners that are providing those letters of support. Okay, so maybe I'll ask Steve to jump in on this one. We won't be providing the exact language here, but around the spirit of the intent here, the call for expressions of interest mentions that successful applicants will be expected to commercialize and or make the technology available through reasonable commercial terms for the benefit of Alberta. And then the specific question is, can you provide sample language for what has been included in the agreements for past funding? Well, I'm not a lawyer, Steve's not a lawyer, we don't have the exact language, but I think you know, Steve can probably offer some words of wisdom around the intent for this statement.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So from a layman's perspective, what everyone has to understand is we're investing significant public dollars and there has to be a public good come out of this. And the public good that we're striving for is both measured in economic terms and emission reduction terms. So if with our public dollars, we advance a technology and then the proponent says, you know what, this is such a great idea, I'm taking it and leaving Alberta and going to go sell it all in the States and not make it available to actually deploy in Alberta in reasonable commercial terms. Our agreements basically say, no, just a minute. In fact, we get a licensing right to make sure that technology is available in Alberta in reasonable commercial terms. So the point I want to make there is we don't own your IP or take your business advantage away from you, but we do expect you to make reasonable efforts to commercialize it and sell it and make it available so it can be deployed in Alberta. We don't want you to take the advantages that came from our investment, advancing your technology, and leave Albertans high and dry from receiving any direct benefits from it.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Steve. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here that build off of that. Maybe I'll take the next one, and the question is, will ERA consider funding a commercial first-of-kind project if it has already funded the same technology at the pilot stage in an earlier ERA funding round? The quick answer to that is yes. We've done not, I would say there are a lot of examples, but there are a handful of examples from our portfolio where we have funded a previous stage of development, and it continues to be a compelling, potentially transformative technology. And we are willing to consider that, there's no guarantee, of course, but consider funding a subsequent stage of development that builds on the success of the previous ERA project. Okay, so another question that's related to that, and maybe I'll ask Steve to jump in here. The question is the challenge limited to new technology only? Are commercially available technologies or commonly implemented solutions that have a potential for reducing large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, such as biomethane flaring or consumption, are those types of opportunities eligible?
Yeah. So the opportunities are eligible. Again, our core business is de-risking technology. So it's not about financing commercially available technologies for this call. So there's got to be some novel dimension to it. So it could be a new business model for deploying a technology that we use in another sector, or a unique configuration. But to be successful, again, as Mark kept reinforcing, this is very competitive. We want to look for how we're advancing something novel that's going to benefit Alberta in terms of economic outcomes and those environmental outcomes. So I would encourage you to apply, but if there's nothing novel, and essentially what you're seeking is financing so you can increase sales of an existing technology, your ability to be successful, I think, will be greatly diminished. So what's the novel dimension about it? How are we advancing an innovation? How are we coming up with new solutions to the problems we're struggling with?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I'm going to continue on because this next question here is very much an extension of that, and says, while realizing that ERA intends to support upcoming technologies, would ERA consider technologies that are currently operating or have been demonstrated at full scale outside of Alberta? And I'll simply add to what Steve mentioned by saying that, similar to the previous answer, yes, we have in some cases provided funding for opportunities that have been demonstrated elsewhere but never in Alberta. That can be, in some cases can be considered a first of kind. Generally, as Steve mentioned, we want to see what is the element of novelty, or another way to put it is, what is the element of risk that ERA's dollars are going to share? Our funds are intended to help de-risk and share risk with private investment. So, if something's been demonstrated elsewhere but hasn't been, and there are some questions around Alberta-specific feedstock or geographic location, or weather conditions, or things like that, I think you can potentially put together a compelling case around novelty and de-risking that needs to happen, bringing something that has been demonstrated outside of Alberta already. Okay, I'm sorry, there's some really, really great questions here. Is there a maximum number of project submissions a given organization can be affiliated with? Steve, did you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, the short answer is no. I'd encourage you not to spread yourself too thin, and make sure that you're going to have the capacity to actually work on the project if you are successful on a number of them. And I can say that in the past, we've had many times where a company, an organization, a consulting firm has been a partner on a number of successful projects. So it's not a limiting factor in terms of our review, but in terms of capacity and ability to actually deliver if you are successful, just keep that in mind.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Steve. This should be another simple one, but I think it's an important clarification, and that is any of the amount paid by ERA required to be paid back or have an interest rate? Did you want to answer that, Steve?
Yeah, sure, Mark, thanks. So essentially, our funding model is we essentially reimburse you for eligible expenses. So if they're eligible expenses, we will pay our fair share of those expenses. So we're not like some other granting agencies that will upfront the grant to you. The wheels may fall off, and then there's a requirement for a refund. Again, since ours is reimbursed, you've done what you said you're going to do in the timelines you said you're going to do. You spent the money you said you're going to spend on the things you said you're going to spend them on. Once we go in and audit it, those are eligible. We do reimburse you. So there's not an amount of money of our money you're holding that would require you to pay it back. Part of that question may be, what happens if it's not successful? And so the technology, as we move forward, we're forced to stop or whatever. Again, we understand that there's a risk of failure when you're playing with innovation and novelty. And again, because of a reimbursement model, there isn't an interest penalty or a repayable amount. The final piece that I should share with you all is that there is a holdback amount. So we do hold back a portion of your eligible reimbursement pending the submission of a final report. So there's a number of checks and balances we put in place to protect the public money and to ensure that the outcomes that we expect are delivered, and that as the successful proponent, you're delivering the outcomes that we committed to on the front end of the agreement. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve. I think that's a great clarification. The next question I want to raise here, we've got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. If a proposal addresses food or farming or forestry innovations that also address COVID-19 food chain impacts, is it looked upon more favorably than other EOIs that do not? I'll start on this one, and Steve is welcome to jump in also. At the expression of interest stage, the criteria don't specifically provide a lot of weighting for what we might call ancillary or other environmental benefits or benefits like that. Having said that, food chain impacts is a big economic consideration among health and other things. And so I would say, if never all other things being equal, that's never the case, but all other things being equal, if you've got strong benefits like food chain impacts or other things like that, it will be looked upon more favorably. Those types of things can help make a good project even better. And when we get to the full proposal phase of the process, we do have a larger number of criteria that are better able to specifically address those types of additional or ancillary benefits. Okay, I'm going to scroll down. This should be another quick one, although there's probably worthwhile adding a little bit of flavor to the answer. Steve, did you want to answer? Could you clarify that the funding is a grant, please?
It is a grant.
Perfect. Well, that is a simple question and a simple answer. All right, I'm going to scroll down, try to find a couple remaining questions I think will be valuable for everybody to hear. If there is a university partner, what portion of the university costs, such as fellowships and tuition costs, will be eligible for the match of the cost by private sector university team? So that's a great question. I'm going to suggest actually we follow up offline on that one. Take a look at our eligible expenses document, and if they still require further clarity, we're happy to have a conversation with you. So this one, I'll ask, Steve can jump in on this one, and I can add some thoughts later if there's anything to add. If a project is not yet at an acceptable TRL for funding, so let's say it's too early stage, will there be opportunities for resubmissions to new challenges at a later date? So I'm going to maybe just implicitly, I'm assuming if you apply for funding and we decide that it's too early stage, will there be opportunity to resubmit later for a new challenge? Did you have any thoughts on that, Steve?
Well, that's a great question. I'd answer it two ways. One is we want people to be successful, and when there's a promising idea and for whatever reason it's not successful, we do work with those proponents, one, to debrief them on the gaps, and two, we recently embarked on some supports. You know, if someone doesn't have quite the right management team or financing experience or whatever gap exists, we can actually help wrap around some services to take them to the level so they are more prepared to be successful when the next call occurs. So the answer is yes. The challenge will be is finding the right way for you to on-ramp into our processes. Another way to answer the question is, if it's an earlier stage project, maybe there's another funding partner that's better suited to advance the technology so it's more ready for meeting our eligibility criteria. Alberta Innovates is a perfect example. They're a strong, trusted partner. They tend to be involved in smaller scale, earlier stage projects. And so often they are the entry point into our ideas pipeline. And so we do hand projects up and back to each other. So essentially the answer is yes. If there's a promising technology and it's not successful this time, we have a number of ways to try to advance it and put it in a position where it can be successful for future funding calls.
Perfect. Okay, we've got 2 minutes left. This one should be quick, and it's a follow-on to Steve's question around grant funding. And so the question is, if it's a reimbursement, how is it a grant? And so maybe I'll clarify. I think maybe technically what we consider our funding to be, or our agreement, is what you might call a conditional grant agreement. So it's grant funding in the sense that we don't require payback. Steve already talked about this. We don't collect interest. We don't take an equity position in the company. So it's sort of pure grant funding in that sense. But the payments are made on sort of an installment basis. So we enter into what we call a conditional grant agreement, where when project milestones are reached, I'm forgetting the word, but we disperse portions of our funding throughout the course of the project. So hopefully that helps. I was hoping to get one more question in. If you could, Steve, the last question I'll ask you to address, and we'll try to do it somewhat briefly. If we need to follow up offline, that's fine. Okay. Why is the minimum 250,000? Does this price out SMEs from participating?
You know, you have to draw the line somewhere. And in terms of the effort on our side and on the proponent side, smaller projects really don't align very well. And again, we're playing later stage TRLs. Sorry, Mark, for using that language again. And so typically those are more capital intensive. But what I would say, and Mark flagged it in his presentation, is that we are prepared to explore adjusting the matching component. So at $250,000, that would mean it's a $500,000 project. If we see something that has great potential, more grassroots, that's smaller scale, those will be considered.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. I think, unfortunately, we're out of time and we have to leave it at that. Thank you for your wonderful questions. So this brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for your interest and your participation today. If you still have unanswered questions after the webinar and after reviewing our supporting materials, please feel free to email us using applications@eralberta.ca. Finally, we hope to have the webinar posted on our website by the end of this week. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody.